Welcome to the show. Here's the new book, Thinking Critically About the Kennedy Assassination, Debunking the Myths and Conspiracy Theories. This is the best book I've read on this subject since Bugliosi's 1,600-page book that no one actually reads. It's really more like a reference encyclopedia.
It is quite long. I found the first, there's actually a shorter version of just the first 300 pages of Reclaiming History. I have it over there somewhere. I forget what he titled that. I think it's called 4 Days in Dallas or something like that. And that's just a history of the weekend of the assassination. And I would recommend that because it's almost like reading a novel.
Right. Yeah, I did the audio version of Bugliosi's book, which was like 14 hours of just that first 300 pages, I guess. And it's stunning how many...
You didn't read the footnotes?
No, I didn't read the footnotes, no. But it's just stunning
how
many
900 pages of footnotes.
Yeah, how many conspiracy theories there are about JFK. But before we get into all that, just give us a little bit of background about yourself, how you got interested in studying conspiracy theories in general at all, and then how you got into JFK. Where are you from? Where'd you go to school? What are your influencers?
All right. Well, I guess we have a lot of time, right? And the other interviews, they're quite short. My name is Michel Gagné. I am a French-Canadian. Born and raised in Quebec, spent most of my life in the province of Quebec. I teach in a junior college. We call them cégeps here. It would be the equivalent of I call it a junior college for Americans.
It's a community college here
basically,
now.
It's like well, no, it's not a community college. It's mostly pre-university students that I have. So it's the equivalent of doing grade 12 or the last year of high school in the States and the first year of university. So our students actually have a tuition-paid pre-university general education after high school, and then that allows them to either go to university or take a trade program. So that's what I do. I teach in the humanities department at Champlain College, St. Lambert. I've been doing that for about 16 years. Before that, I was teaching French and social studies in a high school, as well as I spent a little bit of time teaching French at the college level, but it wasn't for me. I mean, I was qualified for it, but I found teaching French is more like technical work, and I prefer dealing with ideas. I think of myself as a historian of ideas. I've always been interested in political, constitutional issues. I studied a little bit of American, for my master's, I studied a fair bit of American history during the 60s, the Civil Rights Movement, although my principal interest was Northern Ireland. And I was looking at the civil rights movement in an international perspective. And so I think I've always had an interest in the 60s so I think maybe that's why Kennedy I latched onto that. But from a young age, I was always interested in the paranormal, UFOs. I grew up, like you, I grew up in an evangelical Christian setting, though I'm still practicing. And I think I was fascinated with a lot of this end of time prophecy, this is very popular in the 80s. Books like Hal Lindsey, and it made you petrified, but at the same time incredibly curious. In the end, I when I became older, I kind of put a lot of that aside and thought it was a lot of paranoia. And then the younger creationism came up in the 90s, and I think I kind of jumped on that bandwagon for a little while. And then I think that's when the conspiracy theories, the political ones hit, because I was studying political science at McGill University here. Sometimes it's called the Harvard of the North. I don't know. So I was studying, I remember studying a course on American foreign policy. This is 1991, around the time of the first Gulf War. And if you remember, there was a story about Saddam Hussein allegedly killing babies in incubators. And it turns out it was the daughter of some ambassador from Kuwait that had been kind of coached to say all this in front of Congress. And I think that was my first experience with propaganda as a Western phenomena. I had studied Soviet propaganda, but I think I started to see that, propaganda is something that we create. And I think with the end of the Cold War, it became kind of cool to see the United States as kind of the ultimate bad guy around the world. It went from being the policeman to kind of an international bully. And so I think it was a convergence of those things and that Oliver Stone film, JFK, that kind of made me think, there's a whole secret history here. So I think there was always this kind of a fascination with I don't want to say the occult with a capital O, but with like hidden knowledge, secret information. And by the late 90s, I think I was eating up Kennedy assassination stuff along with theories about Freemasons. And then 9/11 happened. And the first thing I thought, oh, the men who killed Kennedy did this. And at the time I was, I think it was my first or second year teaching high school. And to my shame, I've apologized to former students. I remember telling students back in the early 2000s, yeah, most conspiracy theories are wrong. But the Kennedy assassination, well, then that's something else. So it took another 10 years or so before I actually bothered to read the Warren Report. And I think what the biggest click for me, as far as the Kennedy assassination was concerned, was I couldn't find a zigzagging bullet anywhere in the Warren Report. No one was talking about some kind of zigzagging magic bullet. And that's when I realized the story's made up. It's made up by conspiracy theorists, either because they didn't read the book or they're looking for some facile, sort of a straw man fallacy without maybe thinking about it, to kind of a 1-2 punch for the Warren Commission. But then I realized, who's lying to me? Is it Earl Warren or is it Oliver Stone? And I think that kind of clicked something. And I have to tell you, I talk about this in the prologue of the book. I was in the bath. I made this realization, there's no zigzagging bullet in this book. And then I told my wife, well, I got out of the bath and got dressed, obviously. I told my wife, I don't think I believe this anymore. And she thought I meant like our Christian faith. And like, no, I meant like Oliver Stone. And I think she was quite relieved, because even on our honeymoon, I took her to like conspiracy, meccas and places like that. So I would say that it took a long time to get into the Kennedy conspiracy theories. It took some time to get out of it. And then around 2011, 2013, around the 50th anniversary, that's when I thought, you know what, I need to take other people along. I need to kind of, first of all, admit that I was wrong, because I teach critical thinking. The worst thing you want to do is come across as a hypocrite or the type of person you keep telling your students not to trust. And then I realized, okay, well, what do I do from here? There was a Canadian journalist called Jonathan Kay who he used to write for the National Post. You might know him because
I know him very well.
He's one of the editors of Quillette now. So Jonathan and I kind of had a little bit of a friendship online, and he came to speak to my students in Montreal because he's from here. And then he had written this book on 9/11. And I thought, wow, this is great. Somebody should do something like this for Kennedy. Gerald Posner had written a great book, but it was mostly a biography of just Oswald. And at that time, even Bugliosi had not written that thick brick of his, Reclaiming History. So I think the idea, or maybe he had, but I don't think I had read it yet anyways. I wasn't that familiar with it. So I thought, well, why not write a book that kind of helps people reverse engineer the conspiracy theory to the point that they can see where it took a bad turn, where it went from the facts into the land of mythology.
Well, so a couple points there. I agree that I think the appeal of hidden knowledge is pervasive. It's also in religion. This was Easter Sunday. I wrote a piece about the resurrection, which I think is more of a mythic truth than an empirical truth. But, I got a lot of response of people that have probably been reading a little too much of Dan Brown or that nonfiction book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, where the conspiracy theory is that Jesus was never really killed on the cross, that he was just in a coma, and that, they gave him some kind of chemical when they gave him some water or something when he was up on the cross, that put him in a coma for 3 days, and then his followers, whisked him away out of the tomb, and then he and Mary went to India, and then they ended up in France, and they had babies, and, the bloodline of Jesus is still around. If I recall that the authors of that book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, sued Dan Brown for ripping him off, as if they had the real version and he had the fiction version. It's all fiction, but that's a kind of conspiracy
theory. And I think the judge threw it out of court, if I remember, because he said, "Do you really want to go there? Do you want to admit that you made it all up?" Right. And then I was like, oh, so he decided, look, if it's a fiction to start with, he didn't steal, and you're saying he stole your idea, then it's not an actual thing that happened. And you wrote nonfiction, whereas Dan Brown claims it's a fiction. Right.
There was a similar story like that with J.Z. Knight, who was the Washington State psychic that channels Ramtha, the 35,000-year-old spirit warrior that she, would dispense wisdom from in large auditoriums where people paid hundreds of dollars to hear what Ramtha had to say about their lives. anyway, then and she started. It became a pretty lucrative business for her. And then at some point, some German psychic also started channeling Ramtha. And J.Z. Knight sued her. It's like, no, that's my, I. And then the judge was, or the court was something like, so you made it up. Well, no. I mean, but if it's intellectual property because you made it up, and therefore no one can rip you off, like ripping off Harry Potter or something. But that does imply that, well, it doesn't really exist. Anyway, and then I was going to comment on The Late Great Planet Earth, Hal Lindsey's. I was in college when that book came out, and it was huge. I was a Christian at the time, and we were reading the newspaper, the LA Times every day. Oh, look, Henry Kissinger did this, and this happened in the Middle East, and it's all unfolding, and within the next couple of years, it's all gonna happen, right? And then it didn't, and then Lindsay kept coming out with updates. But that book was like one of the best-selling books of the '70s of all books.
I have a copy here somewhere from my dad. Yeah. And I remember that, and I think that's what eventually got me for that is, why do you assume that all these things described in this book, you would be able to know what it is today? Like this strange creature is actually a helicopter, or that's actually a tank, Mm-hmm. And I think what happens is, and I've seen this growing up in the Christian and evangelical church. People tend to interpret ancient documents as though they're all about them. And because their knowledge of history is so limited, they don't realize that the author's actually talking about, say, Nero, or they're talking about Persia. So there's this symbol of a great bear, and then Hal Lindsey would say, oh, that's the Soviet Union. Like, well, no, the bear was a symbol of Persia long before. So sometimes you have to do a lot of digging. You do have to ask the theologians what this is about. You can't just figure it out on your own. So I would say this is one of the ill effects of the Protestant Reformation, though I grew up Protestant, is the belief that not that everyone should read the scriptures on their own, but somehow everybody has equal knowledge and access to these ancient documents that are written in a different language at a different time with a different culture. Sometimes you do need a PhD in Hebrew just to be able to grasp what a particular sentence means or not. So I think for me, it's more a matter of tolerating uncertainty. This is a phrase that I think Carol Tavris came up with. I think she wrote for Skeptic, right? Mm-hmm. So tolerating uncertainty means, and whatever it is that you think is true, whether it's a conspiracy theory or even the Big Bang Theory or whatever, you got to say, look, I could have this wrong. There's a good possibility that I don't know everything, and I'm interpreting things in terms of what I'm expecting to see. Mm-hmm. And I remember you talked about this, I think it was patternicity, you called that. Mm-hmm. And I do that in my class as well. That picture, was it Wittgenstein's duck and the duck and rabbit? If you turn your head around, you realize, I'm not seeing the same picture as the guy over there. I've sometimes asked students not to say anything, to just look at the picture, and then there's other pictures like that are kind of like two pictures in one, and then I say, who sees an old lady? And a couple hands go up, and they're kind of confused, say, who sees a young woman? Oh, then they see their, and then eventually they realize they're not looking at the same image, although they're looking at the same picture, right? And I think that's what happens with a lot of conspiracy theories. We see what we want to see because they serve a different purpose. My book largely argues that there's a whole existential quest for meaning that sometimes is answered, at least partly, by identifying a good and an evil. For Dan Brown, it was Emperor Constantine, he says, made up the whole thing. I was just watching Oliver Stone's latest opus there this weekend, and obviously it's Alan Dulles, right? Alan Dulles is the Darth Vader figure. He's done everything wrong. He controls everything. He knows everything, which is kind of interesting because when I read, what was his name? There was a guy who wrote a book on the Warren Commission not too long ago, and he says basically Alan Dulles was snoozing through much of the deliberations. By that time, he was a bit of a doddering old fool, and that's how a lot of the other people on the commission, a lot of the lawyers saw him. So it's not like he was controlling all information in the commission. He had been sent or been requested by Bobby Kennedy to be there to keep a lid on some of the Castro plots, which of course Bobby Kennedy was profoundly involved in. But somehow that bit of information, like a lot of others, gets just completely taken out of the conspiracy theories. It gets ignored because it doesn't fit. So the conspiracy theory is often a reverse engineered myth.
Yeah, right. Part of the appeal is that it gives you secret knowledge, and that the world is not this complicated, messy, affair that no one can really get their minds around. It's this actual simple Machiavellian black and white, no, Manichaean, sorry, black and white worldview. So the Middle East, I mean, what a mess. And I have no idea how to solve this problem other than maybe the two-state solution, which no one can seem to agree on, and so on. But if, like with Hal Lindsey, oh, no, this is not what you're seeing. What you're seeing is this really simple boom, boom, boom. This is all going to unfold as part of God's plan. Oh, yeah. Okay. And it is reinforcing. It feels good. Like, I understand now.
And it's as if the Bible was written for Reaganite USA 1980s.
That's right.
Never mind that there's been 2,000 years of people reading this book before who never thought, wow, I can't wait for Reagan to come so we can unfold what these mysteries are. And now, exactly. 20, 30, 40 years later, we realize, oh, okay, we got it all wrong.
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah. So let's just kind of define some terms, conspiracies and conspiracy theory. So conspiracies are like two or more people plotting to do something in secret to somebody else or some organization doing this. The conspiracy theory would be the idea about the conspiracy that may or may not be true. So, because you often hear this like, oh, that's just a crazy conspiracy theory as a, pejorative insult. Of course, we know it's nonsense. But in fact, lots of conspiracy theories turn out to be true, right? The Pentagon Papers, the Afghanistan Papers, the WikiLeaks. It's like, oh, so that actually happened? Wait, the CIA did what? We were spying on who without court orders? What? And, it's like, okay, so conspiracies actually do happen. The question is, the conspiracy theories about them, are they true or not? And that's where we get to kind of how to think critically about them. How do you know?
Yeah. Well, Joe Uzinski used this phrase, a conspiracy theory is a theory about a conspiracy. And that really left me kind of empty. I thought, well, that doesn't really tell me a whole lot. Although I like Joe, and he's been on my podcast, I found that if we describe everything that has a conspiracy as a conspiracy theory, we're making the definition so broad that a birthday party becomes a conspiracy theory. Right. Or setting gas prices at the local, mobile station. So I like the definition used by Kassim Kassam. He's a British philosopher. And Kassam says, okay, there are conspiracy theories, small c, small t, and most of the time these are things that nobody actually knew was happening until they were declassified. Project Mogul, this plan to spy on the Russians that turned out to be the cause of the whole Roswell so-called UFO crash, and Operation Northwoods that no one had really heard about until it was declassified in the 90s for the JFK, what was it called, the Assassination Records Review Board. No one was aware that the Air Force had offered some contingency plan to either kill or pretend to kill Americans and blame it on Castro. So Kassam says these are conspiracy theories, small c, small t, but these are not the things that people like Alex Jones are talking about because they're not even aware of them. The conspiracy theories, what he says with a capital C and a capital T, tend to have some very similar patterns. They tend to be, first of all, very anti-authoritarian. They tend to be amateurish. They tend to be very deterministic. He used the term pre-modern, but I think there were some very smart people before the modern era. We can think of, Aristotle, for example. But I think what he means is they're deterministic. They're a little bit like pagan religion that assumes that everything is pre-controlled by these occult forces. I lived some time in Zambia, and although everybody there more or less claims to be a Christian, animism still runs very, very deep. There's this idea that there's no point in fixing your house because if the spirits don't like it, if you're doing something different than your community, they're going to curse you. So there's always kind of this fear that no matter what you do, your life is already planned out. And that's a very non-Western, I would say, the non-modern way of thinking. And conspiracy theories often do that. They assume that the bad guy is so powerful that they can even hide their own existence. They can fake evidence. They can construct, videos. The Zapruder film, for example, that allegedly they say is completely re-edited, Photoshop 50 years before such a thing existed. So there's those elements I think that Kassam I think hits pretty well, is that not all conspiracy theories are equal. And the ones that tend to be the most powerful are forms of political propaganda. For example, they're anti-gun control, or they're anti-oil, or they're there's a lot of them. The JFK theories are often from the left, right? They're against large corporations, or the what do you call it? The relationship between the arms industry and government, which of course is a problem. I had Mike, what's his name? He wrote a book called The Deep State a couple of years ago. Mike Lofgren. I had him on my podcast. Right. Lofgren, he used to be an aide in the American Congress. He was a Republican aide for the Defense Appropriations Committee or something like that. So when he uses the term deep state, he's not talking about some kind of Satan-worshipping pedophiles, in a pizzeria in Washington. He's talking about the people in Congress who, as soon as they're elected, they're already on the phone in some private office, because they can't do this in Congress, trying to raise money for the next campaign. And the money's often coming from corporations, the very same corporations they either used to work with or they'll be working with after, the Halliburton or whatever, something like that. So Lofgren has a very interesting idea that these kinds of quote unquote conspiracies are happening, but they're legal. They're not that hard to find. Everybody's doing them. So I think we have to be careful to say that conspiracy theories are just theories about a conspiracy. I think there's a particular genre, the kind you find on InfoWars, or sometimes on Democracy Now, which is, I wouldn't put on the same level as Alex Jones, but it's more of a left-wing version of looking for these powerful occult forces at work.
Right. So
and they do kind of serve a purpose of political propaganda.
It has to be illegal or immoral to be a conspiracy the way we're talking about it. So someone like Dick Cheney's connection to Halliburton, and then we invade Iraq, and then Halliburton is brought in to rebuild the nation, and the boards of directors and investors in Halliburton profit from it. That really wouldn't be the same kind of conspiracy, right? Because it's actually legal. We may not like it, and people complain about it, and it does seem wrong, but there was nothing illegal about that. So that would be a different kind of conspiracy, or not a conspiracy.
We might call it corruption, even if it's legal.
Yeah.
It could be legal corruption. Politics is an amoral game. There's a lot of people making up stuff to try to put their opponents off. Are all those conspiracies? Well, they're all kind of plans made in a back room to determine how we're going to win the next election, or how we're going to pass a certain law through Congress. I mean, Senator Lyndon Johnson, before he became vice president, was notorious for nipple twisting, I call it. Trying to get to the other person's weakness so he can make a deal, but the deal often would be done very reluctantly, or sometimes they involve prostitutes or things like that. So all of that we could say is conspiracies, but at some point there's so much of it that we need to narrow our focus to saying, well, we're talking about these kinds of conspiracy theories. The ones that are, as I said, often anti-authoritarian, very deterministic, that are very enclosed. They involve usually some element of an echo chamber. Again, I was watching that Oliver Stone film. What's it called? JFK Reconsidered, with Whoopi Goldberg and Donald Sutherland. It's kind of his new. Interestingly, he's putting me in business, because I've been talking so much about his film that was 25 years ago. Now he's repackaged it all. So all of a sudden, my book is not behind the times. It's very factual. But what I noticed there is I took copious notes, and I think it's the same 15 or so talking heads, and they don't seem to have read the HSCA, the Warren Commission, the ARB in their entirety. They just kind of cherry pick little things, and they completely ignore the skeptics, people like you, or people who write for Skeptic or things like that. Or you ran this there was a long piece that a former conspiracist had written. I'm trying to remember his name. And I thought it was a very, very good short piece on the Kennedy assassination.
On JFK, that's right. Skeptic. Right. Well, so I should pause and I don't know if you saw this, but I had Stone on the podcast, and I kind of blew it. I had all my notes and talking points lined up, and I wanted to be friendly and warm and polite as a host. And then I blew it. I just, right off the bat, I asked him, what's the difference between making a drama like JFK in 91, and making a documentary like your current. But then I threw in, like, for example, you had Lee Harvey, you had one of your characters, I think it was Jack Lemmon, say, Oswald shot Maggie's drawers. He was a lousy shot. He couldn't hit the side of a barn door. When in fact he scored 150, whatever it was, 182 out of 254. He was a sharpshooter, second highest ranking in riflery training in the Marines. And he said, we didn't know that back in 91. It's like, well, yeah, I think people could look it up back then. And we didn't include that in the current documentary. I'm like, well, okay, that's good. But anyway, then I started peppering him, and then he got pretty upset. He was like, what is this? And he just stopped at some point when I was going at him and said, I don't want to, I'm going to end the interview. That's it. And his publicist was listening.
Oh, really?
Yeah, his publicist was listening. He said, so-and-so, just let's just end this right now. I don't want to go on. This is not a debatable point. I mean, Oswald had nothing to do with it. I mean, he was a patsy, and this was all done by the CIA and so on. And anyway, I had to pivot to Russia, Ukraine, NATO and all that stuff, and the Putin interviews he did, and then he kind of calmed down. And I felt bad because I was kind of rude to him right at the beginning. I should have been polite, and then say, and I did ask him, if the CIA did it. Ordered the assassination of Kennedy. Who in the CIA? I mean, is it Dulles? Do you think he actually wrote a memo or had a secret phone call and said, let's kill Kennedy? He goes, no, well, it goes higher than that. I said, well, who's higher than Dulles? Johnson or, anyway. And he, he didn't have any evidence for that, and I tried to steer it to, there's a convergence of evidence from multiple lines of inquiry pointing to Oswald. There's no convergence of evidence pointing to anybody. Dulles, the mafia, the KGB, the Cubans, who knows? So how do you think about that? And that pretty much ended the JFK part of the conversation. It was frustrating, and so because his film, I watched it too. There's now a 4-hour version where you can really get into the weeds. And
I watched the one that was available on Apple TV. So I think it was a 2-hour one.
2-hour version, yeah. So there again, it's that back to your mythic undertones of secret knowledge. It's not just some lone nut and the contingent chancy nature of history, but it's all deeply entwined with the military-industrial complex and big weaponry and secret CIA programs. And I don't know. I mean, it's I think that's the appeal to a lot of his followers. And he's such a good filmmaker that, JFK is a great film. It's just hard to watch it and not think there just had to be something else going on. Even though you look it all up, each and every point is refutable. And as you do in the book, boing, 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 he got this wrong, this wrong, this wrong, this wrong. And but
I needed 500 pages.
Yeah, exactly right. So the average person watching it,
there's so much.
Yeah, there's so much. Bugliosi opens his book talking about he gave a speech at a conference of lawyers, right after JFK, was such a huge hit as a film, and he asked them, how many of you saw Oliver Stone's JFK? Almost every hand went up. And, how many of you think there probably was a conspiracy? Every hand goes up. How many of you have read the Warren Report? Nobody. And he's like, you are lawyers. You're supposed to assume this person is innocent until proven guilty. You haven't even read the evidence. And he said it was very, very revealing.
Okay. Yeah, I remember the scene in the JFK film you're talking about. I think it was the Walter Matthau character, who was actually meant to be, was it Senator Long, Huey Long's son, right? So, in fact, that's one of the people who influenced Jim Garrison to dig into the Kennedy assassination, because there were assassinations or conspiracies or conspiracy theories about them in Louisiana for a long time, dating all the way back to Huey Long. So it's interesting how the local politics in Louisiana is what led to, I would say, I call it the Oak Island effect. I don't know if you're familiar with Oak Island, this little island off the coast of Nova Scotia that has been dug and redug over 300 years, people looking for anything from pirate treasures to the Ark of the Covenant. And in the end, they just destroy the place. You probably can't recognize anything of the original island, all based on the fact that they found some coconut husks on the beach and a couple sinkholes. And the assumption was that somebody came and dumped all this some treasure there. But it turns out sinkholes are natural there. I found out coconut husks were kind of like packing peanuts back then. So any ship that's trading anything that's like some illegal contraband would likely go there and dump things or just use it as a latrine or an outpost to fix a ship. And what happened in Oak Island is kind of what happened to the Kennedy assassination lore, all the literature, is it got so destroyed by amateur research that no one can find their way around it anymore. Because there's all these wild goose chases. Everything that relates around New Orleans with Jim Garrison's investigation, the Clay Shaw trial, all of that is largely just, it's taking you off-road into a fantasy world that had nothing to do with Lee Oswald. Like one of the few little things they quote that's true is that Lee Oswald had this address stamped on his anti-Castro leaflets of a Camp Street address, 544 Camp Street, which apparently was another entrance of a building where this anti-communist former FBI agent Guy Bannister had his office. That's a big deal in all of Oliver Stone's productions. What they don't tell you ever is that there were a bunch of leaflets that had 2 other different addresses, and no one ever mentions that. So Oswald was stamping a bunch of different addresses and sometimes no address whatsoever on these leaflets. But they pick only the one that fits their theory and ignore the rest. And this is something many people, Jim Garrison was an ace at this. He would kind of just, he would make up his mind as to who he wanted to arrest, and then he would start building a scenario against them and only looking for evidence to support that. And unfortunately, that's the kind of thing that passes for research in conspiracy. They call themselves conspiracy researchers. I use the word conspiracist without, and I said at the beginning of the book, I don't mean this pejoratively, but I can't think of a better term. Sometimes JFK buff, but the late John McAdams was a JFK buff, but he was definitely in favor of the single gunman theory. So sometimes we're stuck with our terms, but definitely it's not when you look at the kind of research that passes for research in the conspiracy theory and the kind of research that you find, say, in Posner's book, or even better, an academic article like those written by John Latimer in the 70s about testing the Mannlicher Carcano, it doesn't even compare. It's like grown-ups versus 7-year-olds. But they don't see that because they don't listen to other people. They don't do that kind of reading. And like I'm surprised. I'm not surprised that Oliver Stone didn't know who you were, because you're not the kind of person that would be of any interest to him. Because you have you're not going to agree with the perspective. You don't come from the right denomination, to put it that way.
Yeah. Well, so one point people have made is that, that's what attorneys do. But like Bugliosi, he's an attorney, he's a prosecutor, and so he's only presenting the evidence that convicts Oswald, and he's not telling you about all the evidence that points to other possible conspiracies involved. And that's kind of true, I guess. And just by definition, that's what attorneys do. They're paid to defend their client and present only the evidence that makes their client look good. And that's why you have an adversarial system, because somebody on the other side says, "Wait, hang on, what about this and this and this?" And then you go back and forth. But I don't really get that from you or Posner, or you're not an attorney, but Bugliosi. He does present the arguments from the other side. So, and you do this in great detail in your book. Here's their argument, here's the response, here's their argument. And you quote them. This is what they're saying that they think happened. But let's just talk about for a minute, why is the Kennedy thing so big? Lincoln was assassinated by a conspiracy, and, that was kind of a done deal within a matter of hours and days. They knew who it was. And there's not, massive conspiracy theories about that. Or McKinley was assassinated. And Roosevelt became president. Let's see, who else? There was an attempt on Reagan's life, on Ford's life. Squeaky Fromm tried to kill Gerald Ford. And what's his name? The crazy guy that was in love with Jodie Foster tried to shoot Reagan. And
is that Hinckley?
Hinckley, right? Right.
John
And
Hinckley Jr. Yeah.
there were a couple attempts on Franklin Roosevelt, and so on. But there's not massive conspiracy theory industry around all the attempts to assassinate or have assassinated U.S. presidents, except for Kennedy. What's the deal with that? Why is that?
That's a good question. You know, there are others. I mean, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and John Lennon, right? Those are the ones that you're going to keep hearing about. And maybe Marilyn Monroe, because a lot of people think there was some kind of connection with the Kennedys. So these are the types of assassination attempts that do get a lot of press because they fit, I think, a particular narrative. I think the best book on the subject I've read, and it influenced mine, is a book called Camelot and the Cultural Revolution by James Pearson, who's a political scientist. And I'm always amazed that this book doesn't get a lot of visibility because it deals a lot with the whole idea of how Kennedy got mythologized. Certainly Lincoln is one of the most mythic figures in American history, and his death made it even more so. The difference that Pearson talks about is that Lincoln, when he was shot, had kind of already done what he was meant to do. He's remembered for what he did, right? He won the Civil War and he freed the slaves. Kennedy gave a bunch of speeches. And apart from that, not a lot. There's the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which was one of his greatest accomplishments. And then after that, you know, he gets shot before he can figure out what to do about Vietnam. I'm deeply convinced that Kennedy would have had to stay in Vietnam after the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem was the biggest problem to the Americans, even though he was their biggest ally in East Asia. So a lot of conspiracists need, especially Stone, who was a Vietnam veteran, they need to deal with the whole Vietnam War issue. Why did the United States lose that war? Or why did they go there in the first place? So they look for a hero, Kennedy. They look for a demon, Johnson. And they look for some kind of some evil force, the military-industrial complex. And then what happens after Kennedy, there is I would say there's two things that happen. We don't go straight into a period of great despair and cynicism. Instead, what happens is, and Pearson talks about this, Kennedy gets glorified after his death. Mrs. Kennedy deliberately used the narrative that Kennedy was a martyr for civil rights. And that's how she organized the funeral, all of the Lincoln imagery that was used in the funeral. She gave an interview to, what's his name, White. I forget his first name.
Theodore White.
I think he was writing for Theodore White. This famous interview where that's where the first time the phrase Camelot comes in. No one was using the phrase Camelot while Kennedy was in office. I mean, there was this whole kind of prestige like a royal family is in the United States. But it's really that article that gets this whole idea that Kennedy was going to bring peace and you know, put an end to segregation, that he gets identified with this mythic figure of King Arthur. And then also, I think it was Earl Warren, who, even though they knew that it was a communist who'd been arrested, he still spoke about Kennedy's death in the days and weeks after the assassination, that it was a culmination of intense hatred in the South. So everybody's basically speaking about Kennedy as though he's been killed by the Ku Klux Klan, which of course he wasn't. He was killed by a communist. And for a guy like Jack Ruby, who didn't understand these differences, he was not a sophisticated political thinker, but he was a very proud Jew and a scrapper and a guy who wasn't afraid to stand up to bullies. And he thought, if Lee Oswald, this communist, hates black people and he kills a Catholic, and what's he going to do next? Blame it on the Jews? And so he decides to shoot Oswald, right? So I would say that right after the assassination, everybody's confused because the story they're expecting to hear is some Southern racist killed Kennedy. And maybe some of them would have, but it wasn't, they didn't get to Kennedy first. It was this young, disgruntled Marxist. And particularly for people on the left, that didn't resonate. How could this communist, this Marxist, in some ways one of us, because the first conspiracists were on the left wing. How could this guy be at fault here. No, it's got to be some kind of Southern racist or some evil fascist element. So that kind of is what happens in late 1963, 64. Johnson rides this wave to defeat Barry Goldwater and pass the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. But then the Gulf of Tonkin incident happens. And the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem had already happened. So the world that Johnson inherits within 6 months has completely changed. And that's when the cynicism hits in. Because he's promising this great society. He passed Medicare, Medicaid. He even passed, this is ironic, he's the guy who passed the Freedom of Information Act that allows all these conspiracy theorists to dig into and ask for documents. So it's not as if Johnson came into the office thinking, I'm completely going to undo what Kennedy did. In many ways, he pursued many of Kennedy's plans, sometimes even more so, because Johnson was more interested in domestic politics than Kennedy. Kennedy's objective was always international politics and let the other people deal with the domestic front. Johnson was not particularly gifted in international politics. His ability was backroom nipple twisting and getting social programs passed. So when he comes to office, he's listening to his generals a lot more than Kennedy did. And he trusts that they're saying, look, 6 months, in 6 months, a year, we'll have dealt with Vietnam. We just need a bit more troops, a bit more troops, a bit more troops. And unfortunately, I would say Johnson didn't have the acumen that maybe Kennedy had to be much more wary about getting involved in Vietnam. But I don't think Kennedy would have had much of a choice, because without Ngo Dinh Diem being the strongman in Vietnam, they had to send in more and more troops to support this faltering government in Saigon. So I would say that what happens is Kennedy gets put on a pedestal. He becomes like Jesus 2.0. And then what happens is this, the Vietnam War and all these other things, the counterculture come in, and suddenly it's like the United States has lost its way. And everybody thinks if Kennedy had lived, we would have this utopian America that they were dreaming of. Now, there is a part in the book, I do this little thought experiment and say, well, think about what would happen to Obama if Obama had been shot, God forbid, in his second or third year as president. Everybody would have said today, he's the guy who would have brought free health care to everybody in the United States. But of course, we know that didn't happen, right? He became, I wouldn't say a bad president. I very much admired Obama. He was a great speech giver. He had a lot of similarities with Kennedy, right? First black president, first Catholic president. But in the end, he was kind of beat down by the pressures of being a two-term president. This happened to Bush. It happened to Reagan in some ways with Iran-Contra. So if Obama had died in his first few years, he would be today that heroic, mythical, messianic figure that Kennedy became.
Well, remember,
on the other side, had Kennedy not died...
Remember, he got the Nobel Prize for peace because he said, well, we should eliminate nuclear weapons. Well, of course, almost nothing happened other than just kind of reducing the number that we had. And I don't know how you get to nuclear zero in the first place. I'm not sure anybody could do that. But that was the idea.
Like
so
COVID
had he
zero.
Been killed,
So
had he been killed, it would have been, or had he died in office in that second or third year, it would have been, we would be to nuclear zero now. Putin wouldn't have nuclear weapons because Obama would have taken care of that. It would have been mythologized.
Green energy would have been everywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
but let me finish this point here. Had Kennedy survived after 63, there's a whole bunch of other things that could have happened. The whole issue for Cuba could have gone nuclear while Kennedy was in office. Because Kennedy was the one pushing the line on Cuba. And for the conspiracy theorists who say he didn't, at least the CIA and the military were, and Johnson shut it all down. So it is to Johnson's credit that Fidel Castro survived into his 80s. Because otherwise he was a dead duck, up until 1963. So had Kennedy survived, and even if he had beaten Goldwater, which is not absolutely certain, then, what would have happened in second term? He could have been impeached for all of the affairs he had. I mean, I talk a little bit about it in the book. Pearson talks more about it. There was a lot of womanizing that was either illegal because some girls were underage, or Alan Romech, for example, was possibly a Stasi agent for the East German spy network. There was one of Kennedy's mistresses. What was her name? Exner. Judith Exner,
right?
Who was a consort of a mobster. So, you could equally surmise that in 1967, the United States may have left Vietnam, or it may have gotten worse, plus Cuba, plus Kennedy getting impeached for a bunch of other, smaller malfeasance. So it's really iffy to predict the future, but that's what I think conspiracy theories do. They give us an alternate timeline that we imagine would be perfect compared to this one. And then this nostalgia and despair combine to create an alternate narrative. They love the word alternative media and alternative history. Stone uses it all the time. But, I do teach a course on utopias. They don't turn out the way they're usually planned to, right? I spent a lot of time studying Jonestown. And everybody thought Jonestown was something magical until Jones showed up. And then everything went to hell. Almost literally, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. So much of Stone's thesis about the CIA's involvement in the military industrial complex backing that was that Kennedy was going to get us out of Vietnam. So what do we know in the record about what Kennedy's plans were for Vietnam?
I think that's a really tough one, because even a lot of people around Kennedy were not sure. We get different accounts from different advisors. And it's the same thing with whether or not Kennedy wanted to keep Lyndon Johnson on the ticket for 64. I think there's a lot of legitimate historians who say, I don't think Kennedy had made up his mind yet on either of those counts. But on one side, he needed Johnson, and on the other, he needed Diem. And but Diem was becoming more of a problem than anything in Vietnam, because Diem was he was letting Buddhist monks burn themselves in the street. He was actually more heavy-handed against people who wanted more democracy. He was a nepotist. He would only appoint Catholics, no Buddhists in his government. So I think Kennedy was of two minds. And that famous press conference he gave, not press conference, the interview he gave to Walter Cronkite, I think it was in September 63, you can see him hesitating. Now, on one hand, he says, we're not going to abandon Vietnam, South Vietnam, they're our ally. On the other hand, it's their war. But I think it's a little bit like Ukraine right now. We don't want to send troops, but how many people are in Ukraine right now who are, advisors? How many volunteers? How many Americans, Canadians, and Brits are there in Ukraine right now who are actually doing military work? We don't know. And I think it's the best interest of the Western governments not to say if they do know. There could even be naval SEAL teams for all I know. But international politics in the age of the Cold War has to come with, what's that phrase there? Deniability, right? So that you're never going to trigger something worse. You want influence, but you can't be seen as though you're directly influencing the outcome. That's why there were the assassination plots and Operation Mongoose in Cuba. The Kennedy government knew they had to do something about Cuba, but it couldn't be an invasion anymore. And I think Vietnam is the same thing. I think Kennedy, I don't think he wanted the direct approach. He saw that guys like Curtis LeMay were maybe a little too quick on the trigger. But at the same time, he was getting really bad news from Maxwell Taylor and even civilian advisors. From what I remember, Ambassador Lodge, whom Kennedy had defeated in Massachusetts for the Senate, actually was telling Kennedy, this is a bit of a hopeless situation if you keep Diem in power. And we all know how it happened once Diem was removed. I mean, things didn't get better, they got worse in South Vietnam. As long as someone like Kennedy or Johnson believed in the domino theory, there was going to be an escalation, I think, of war in Vietnam. But I defer to the historians of Vietnam. I really like this book it's an older book now. I'm trying to remember the author's name there. It's just called The History of Vietnam. I'm trying to find it here. It's in my bookcase, but it's covered by other books right now. I think it would have been a different war. I think it would have been a different war with Kennedy, but there still would have been some kind of a conflict there. So for people who say he was going to withdraw, they're misreading the documents. People like Fletcher Prouty back in the 70s and 80s were able to say a bunch of things about classified documents, but now they're all over the internet. And it's clear that Prouty and a lot of the people who influenced this trope about Kennedy withdrawing from Vietnam are really just cherry picking little bits here and there. Like this idea that he was going to remove 1,000 troops by Christmas '63. This is a way to kind of pressure Diem to get his act together to make him believe that he was losing support at home. But at the same time, this was a very, very small contingent of troops. And it was clear that the Kennedy had been escalating, much more than Eisenhower in Vietnam. It's hard to say. Again, we're trying to read the future. I was trained as a historian, and one thing a historian should never do is predict the future.
Yeah. So I think there's an element of what I call constructive conspiracism. That is, enough conspiracy theories turn out to have been true that it pays to err on the side of making one type of error rather than the other. That is, assume the worst. Assume that the signals are leaning toward an actual conspiracy that was happening. So when Alex Jones rants insanely about false flag operations, in fact, this, Project Northwoods, or the Northwoods document that came out, in 97 with the Church Committee, that, Kennedy's advisors had brought to him a list of things they could do as an excuse to invade Cuba and kill Castro, including, flying jets, harassing American airliners with MiG-like jets and blame it on the Russians, and a whole list of those things. And to Kennedy's credit, he declined to do all those things because it would have been totally insane, like shooting down an American.
He threw it in the garbage.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but the fact that, wait a minute, our government was doing this? His top advisors were suggesting this? Yeah. And, even the Bay of Pigs, after that, the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was just a genius in navigating that and avoiding the Third World War. But in fact, it came out later that we had previously placed Jupiter missiles in Turkey, right at Russia's doorstep. And Khrushchev was not happy about that. So he retaliated and said, well, we're going to put missiles in Cuba. And when you read that, you go, oh, okay, well, there's kind of a logic to what Khrushchev did there. He's not the Darth Vader, and Kennedy is the hero that defeated him. In fact, it was just kind of real politics.
Yeah, it's a chess game. It's an international chess game. And if you accept that it's an amoral game, depending on who's in power, I think a Trump and an Obama would deal very differently with some of these issues. But Obama still had Osama bin Laden killed. It's not like he became just a harbinger of peace. He just decided to use different methods. A lot of people will criticize Obama for how many drone strikes were used. He saved American lives, but there were still a lot of Iraqis dying. So it's a dirty game, unfortunately. But human nature is such that if you think the United States is the only country where there's racism, where there is poverty, then you're really not looking all over the place. Because in many ways, the West is a much more pleasant place to live than some parts of the East. I don't know how much you've traveled. I've been briefly in Russia in the 90s, and it was a very, very sad place. Everything had kind of fallen apart during the Soviet era, and it's as if no one had cleaned up anything. I was there in 95, and public toilets didn't work. Everything was just in shambles. I've also spent some time in Africa, where, as I mentioned, animism runs so deep that people can be very superstitious. There is a lot of racism there, but it's tribal. It's people of the same skin color, but they discriminate against each other on a different basis than the white-black divide. My wife's from Northern Ireland. There was a 30-year civil war there, lots of racism, but it was all white people, So when we start thinking that the United States either is a utopia or some kind of a horrible world hegemon that destroys everything that's good, both of those stories are wrong.
Right. What were you doing?
And here I live in Canada, so it's easy for me to criticize your country.
That's right. Yes.
But mine has plenty to criticize too.
Well, we have all the power in the world. We could invade Canada and just take you guys, but we don't. So what does that say, right? Yeah, so there's a lot of hindsight bias. After the fact, you look at what we did and go, oh, so that, we were bad or we were good or whatever, something like that. So the scapegoat theory, I also like that in your book, the discussion of, trying to find a scapegoat. This is Rene Girard's theory, and as it applies to the military-industrial complex. Let's talk about how that applies, not just to Kennedy, but to any conspiracy theory.
Well, I read Girard because I had an interest in theology as well. And what I found very interesting is, as I mentioned earlier, growing up in a Protestant culture, you sometimes demonize the Catholic culture. Girard was what I would call more of a Christian existentialist. And I was already a bit of a fan of Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky. So I think there's a room for existentialism and faith and reason to converge at a particular point. I don't know if I do it well, but I like to think that those three traditions, the best of those three traditions, can kind of meet each other. And there's a certain humility in front of knowledge and understanding that while humans are rational, they're also sometimes irrational. While we want to be people of reason, we do rely on faith, even in scientific theories, So Girard kind of taught me that sometimes we don't realize that we're the enemy in our own story. We're the bad guy. And because he often talks about theological issues, and particularly the idea about the Christ on the cross, and this I understand why your friend there, what's his name, the God delusion,
Dawkins.
Dawkins, that's right. So Dawkins says he hates this idea of this Christian God who goes around beating up on people and on his own son. And I agree with Dawkins. I think that's a horrible story, but I don't think that's the story of Christianity. I think that's one that kind of came in with John Calvin and other people like that. Some theologians imagine like good Jesus and really mean God. But instead, what Girard proposed was that God came and accepted to be the scapegoat, accepted to be the object of the wrath of humanity. So rather than this God takes his wrath out on humans, he's going to come and put an end, or the beginning of the end, in this human culture of scapegoating. We always think that we're in the right to do something awful, violent, in the pursuit of some good objective. And conspiracies, real conspiracies, often fit that mold, right? We think, well, it is illegal to do X, but I'm doing it to protect my family, right? I'm doing it to restore the kind of country I want to live in. Think of the January 6th revolt. I think most people there knew it was illegal, but they thought there's a greater good. But that greater good is often very perverse. It involves us treating other human beings like objects, or sometimes worse, with violence, or at least violent language. So the scapegoating mechanism, as he points out, is this human propensity to paint the enemy as some kind of evil that must be overcome with human means, and they lose their humanity in that process. So he's trying to say that in the Christian scriptures, the Christian God is basically trying to put an end to that by saying the one innocent who does not deserve death is going to get killed by the mob, so that the mob realizes, Jew and Gentile alike, we've killed God. Right? So it's interesting. He starts with what Nietzsche said, the death of God. And he says Nietzsche didn't realize how right he was, in the sense that when the non-believer sees themselves as the person who perpetrated the murder of God in the story of Christ on the cross, then that's when they switch and they realize, oh my goodness, I'm the bad guy in the story. So I think what conspiracy theories do very well is pushing blame out, saying, but I didn't do anything wrong, I'm the victim. The world is after me. They're out to get me. The Vietnam War was an attack by the government against these poor Vietnamese. And one thing I mentioned in that section was, well, what about that horrible that village that was destroyed? What the name escapes me. In Vietnam, the My Lai massacre, right? Okay, so maybe some general said go and kill some civilians, but they didn't put a gun to his head of the soldiers who raped and pillaged and burned babies and put them into mass graves. There's a human acceptance to go along with these things. And conspiracy theories often pick a scapegoat. Whether or not they're innocent, it doesn't matter if the evidence is there, it feels right. So Lee Oswald has to be rehabilitated because he's like one of us. He's a leftist who didn't like the government. Whereas Clay Shaw, well, he's a usable patsy. We can destroy Clay Shaw. No children, no wife. For many people, he's gay, so it doesn't matter. He doesn't look normal, or he's too rich. Whatever it is, Jim Garrison went after Clay Shaw, and still today, Clay Shaw has been one of the biggest victims of the of JFK conspiracy theories. But at the same time, many people have been just badmouthed. I feel very bad for Commander James Humes, for example, who was forced at the last minute to build a team to conduct Kennedy's autopsy. What a lot of conspiracists don't tell you is it was Mrs. Kennedy who actually said, no, he's going to have a military autopsy at a naval facility because her husband was in the Navy. She didn't want his body to be exposed in a public hospital where people could see it, where pictures might go on the newspaper. Kennedy had a bunch of physical ailments, possibly also venereal disease. That's not certain, but it's been argued by people like Robert Dallek and other historians. So there was a lot to hide about Kennedy by his own family. So they chose this facility. Poor Commander Humes, who's never conducted a forensic autopsy, doesn't have a choice. He gets the order, and he does his best. He gets the highest ranking people he can find on short notice, and he conducts what I think was as good an autopsy he could do under the conditions it was given. There was no admiral in the room telling him what to do. There was Admiral Berkeley, who was Kennedy's doctor, telling him, go quicker, go quicker, go quicker, because Mrs. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy want to get this over with so that they can take the body to the White House. So it's not like there was this military operation. It was so haphazard, so last minute, that no one could have known until Mrs. Kennedy said, no, we're going to go to Bethesda, that the autopsy was going to be done at Bethesda Naval Hospital. It was a teaching hospital. There was a better military hospital closer to Andrew Air Force Base, but they didn't go there because it was what the Kennedy family desired. So all of that gets ignored to create some kind of an occult, fearful story that turns out to be wrong. And James Humes has been, sorry, I don't know if I can say this, he's been peed on for decades, probably for something he never chose, and it only lasted 3 hours of his life.
So what you're talking about here is all the conspiracy theories around what the autopsy really showed and how much they doctored up the body to make it look like it was a lone assassin rather than multiple shooters and so forth. And so what you're saying is that the kind of randomness of this haphazard autopsy better explains than that the whole thing was carefully orchestrated, much like the Zapruder film, that each frame was picked apart and doctored and so forth, which would be very difficult to do at that time. But back to the scapegoating, what did Oswald mean when he said, I'm just a patsy? And how are people interpreting that, the conspiracists interpreting that in terms of this like scapegoating theory?
Well, everybody assumes that somehow Oswald would have been telling the truth. A lot of people who are under arrest for a major crime and a murder are not going to tell the truth. Now, whether or not he was going to say he's a patsy, I defer to his brother. His two brothers thought he was guilty. His brother Robert went on to write a book, which no one quotes, and I don't know why. I quoted about it in my chapter on Oswald. I think Robert Oswald was in the best position to know what his brother was and wasn't capable of. And he said his brother had always been a ticking time bomb. He always hated authority. He had, various learning disabilities, though he was quite sharp and smart in other ways. Hated his mother, had slept in the same bed as her till she was 12, felt abandoned by his brothers, particularly his older half-brother, John Pick, who had basically kicked Lee and his mother out of his small apartment in New York when they went to live there because Lee had threatened his wife. So he had been a ticking time bomb for a long time, but he thought he was really smart. He told his wife at some point he's going to be prime minister or president of Cuba or Russia or the United States. And he thought that the whole time in police custody, he was playing with the cops, that he was trying to see whether or not they could outsmart him or he could outsmart them. Oswald asked his brother Robert to find, and he also asked this to I think it was Mrs. Payne, whom Oswald's wife lived with, Ruth Payne, to find him a lawyer in New York called John Abt, ABT, who had a reputation for defending left-wing activists. Now, Abt never got contacted, but that was what he wanted. It looks as though Oswald wanted to go to trial. And on trial, he was going to get his say. He was going to be able to talk about the United States and the Soviet Union and Cuba, who had rejected him also, and ultimately how, his view of Marxism-Leninism, not communism, was the one true ideology. He did that a little bit on TV in New Orleans that summer. He got his 15 minutes of fame when he was on a radio program. He got interviewed for the TV, and I think he wanted more of that. He did crave attention. This is what Gerald Ford concluded. He wrote a book on Oswald after the Warren Commission ended, but he was a very politicized guy. Was he an angry lone nut? Well, he was angry. He was lone. Certainly there was some mental health issues. I spent a lot of time advocating for mental health. I think probably he was either bipolar or had something that we call borderline personality. What's it called? Borderline personality disorder, or something of that oppositional personality disorder. One of those personality disorders. There's definitely was something not right with him, but he was rational enough to plan an assassination. There's no doubt about that. But I don't think he would have been a reliable assassin for anybody, including the Soviets or the Mafia or the CIA.
Yeah, when you read the history of his life, he would be the last person the KGB or the CIA or even the mob would select as, this is our man. You want somebody who's not a blabbermouth, who isn't seeking attention.
Well, he wasn't. He was actually very tight-lipped. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was very tight-lipped. I would say Jack Ruby was definitely not a mob hitman.
Yeah. But also you rarely hear people talking about that he tried to assassinate General Edwin Walker, 6 months before he shot Kennedy, with apparently
that's right.
the same rifle, right? And Walker was a far-right anti-communist. And didn't he tell his own wife he wanted to try to assassinate Nixon also? And he was going to hijack a plane and go to Cuba. I mean, just these kind of crazy, wild fantasy ideas that he was floating around. So the idea of killing the president to get some attention or whatever his motive was, that's not completely crazy either. That kind of fits his personality and his history.
That's right. And I point out that a lot of people have been confused to why he would kill Kennedy. I say maybe you should think of it a different way, is why would he want to kill the most powerful American statesman who happened to drive past his workplace when everything in his life was falling apart? So does it have to be Kennedy or not? He may have respected Kennedy as a man, but he may have not liked the office, the country, and the policies enough to say that he was going to put an end, or at least put a dent in American imperialism, right? He had been thinking that way ever since as a teenager, he heard about the Rosenbergs, and they were executed for sharing secrets with the Soviets. So there's no doubt he was a Marxist. I mean, this goes all the way back to when he was 15 years old. He wasn't recruited by the CIA when he was 15, when he was a truant riding the subway around New York, avoiding school and going into reform schools. If the CIA did recruit him, it wasn't then. It would have been a lot later. And he was a Marxist from his teenage years. An unsophisticated, perhaps, thinker, but some guy who liked to read, particularly newspapers and some communist literature.
Mm-hmm. Right. So just go through kind of the convergence of evidence that points to him as at least one of the assassins. I think I agree with you. He was the lone assassin. But at the very least, conspiracists should admit, he actually pulled the trigger, but there were other shooters, but for sure he did it. What's the best evidence we have for that?
I had a feeling you might ask that. I actually made a list of notes here. I want to read them out.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, I mean, first of all, look, those pictures you didn't mention the pictures, but you mentioned he wanted to kill Edwin Walker, all right? And the best evidence we have of that is he made those pictures a few days, I think it was a week before the actual shooting. And conspiracy theorists are often wondering, well, why would you take pictures of yourself that are incriminating? Like, well, why do members of Al-Qaeda do these suicide videos before they go off and blow up, the USS Cole or whatever? And that's because they want to be remembered as a great martyr for the cause. Oswald actually shared some of these pictures with a friend. Someone, his wife, seems to have written "Hunter of Fascists, ha ha ha" on the back in Russian. So he may not have said what his plans were, but he thought, I'm going to be sharing these when I'm famous. There's going to be a record that I'm a hunter of fascists. The pictures, the HSCA, my chapter on the pictures is mostly just a report of what the HSCA did, because they did such a brilliant job at proving the authenticity of those 3 backyard photographs. Even at what angle Marina took them, the fact that gradually from one snapshot to the next, she learned how to hold the camera better. They're in better and better focus. Although they were found in the wrong series. So sometimes you see the best photo first, as in my book, and then the lesser one at the end. And then they could also show that the sun had moved a little bit from minute to minute, that the shadow on the nose was not quite the same. It's not a face that got kind of pasted on it. So the pictures show that there's an intent to use those weapons for a violent purpose. And the weapons were used to kill Kennedy and to kill Officer J.D. Tippit. So I think that the photos right away show that there was an intention. And I think Vincent Bugliosi made a very good point. To convict a person of a murder, you don't have to prove motive. You just have to prove intent. I think Oswald did have a motive, maybe a mixture of motives, but he was so tight-lipped, he never got a chance to tell everybody. But there are a number of theories, and I talk about them in the book. So the photos, I think, are important. The weapons, they were able to trace them to his own post office box, to a name that he kept using as a fake name, Alec J. Hidell. Alec is what they called him in the Soviet Union. That was his nickname because they didn't like the name Lee. Russians thought it sounded like a girl's name. So Alec was like his Russian name. And Hidell, I don't know, they say it sounds like Fidel, maybe. There's different theories about why. But he did have the fake ID on him. And that fake ID was clearly made by him. It had his picture. It was in his wallet. Some authors have pointed out, and I think that's a pretty strong argument, about his behavior after the assassination. He was the only one who left work that day, basically fleeing the scene.
Well, yeah, here's
he was witnessed by many people shooting police officers.
People watching it here, the backyard pictures. So he's holding that Mannlicher Carcano rifle and a newspaper to show the date or to show what? Yeah, 2 Marxist newspapers that he had read frequently. I think to send them the image to say, look, I'm part of the gang. Right. Here we go. And then there's yeah. And those pictures were proven to be authentic. There's no crop marks. A lot of that is because newspapers are using like 2nd and 3rd generation prints, or they themselves had cropped out pieces of the rifle to make the picture look crisper. So most of the allegations of cropping and changing the picture is because the newspaper prints were slightly altered for print, but not the originals, not the ones the police had in custody. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. I think the testimony of his brothers are very, very strong. I challenge anybody who thinks that Oswald was innocent and working for the CIA to read Robert Oswald's book. I think it's called Lee, a Portrait of the Assassin by His Brother or something like that. His state of mind, there's no doubt that Oswald had violent dispositions. Ruth Payne and many others could attest that he was violent with his wife. Though his wife, a lot of people don't realize that his wife was very verbally abusive with him in public. She demeaned him. She often mocked his sexual prowess in front of others. Now, most people who didn't speak Russian didn't get it, but she could be very cutting to him. And I think that kind of was an added frustration he had. And then Robert Oswald points out, this is an interesting factoid, but I think it's significant. Oswald never had a dad. His dad died while he was still an infant. Now, his dad apparently was a real piece of work, and he was a violent man. And anyways,
I don't think he would have loved his own dad if he met him. His father was named after Robert E. Lee, the Southern general. And so were Lee and his brother Robert, you see. So it's interesting how the father probably had some clannish tendencies.
Yeah.
And that may be why there's an element of parricide that Robert Oswald suggests. So there's this idea that his father was a good-for-nothing, but he did have a stepdad for a while, whose name was Edwin Ekdahl. So his first name, Edwin, is the same name as Edwin Walker, the general that he tried to kill. And he had this Bostonian accent that was very similar to Kennedy's. So this is all supposition. But when Kennedy sees a man like Edwin Walker or watches John F. Kennedy on TV, he's reminded of the dad that his mother chased away. Edwin Ekdahl had been a good stepdad, but not a very good husband because he was cheating on Margaret Oswald. So Oswald had some mommy issues. He had some daddy issues. His brothers left when they went to join the military when he was in his teens. I think he always looked up to his brothers, but they weren't around much after a certain age. He's a guy who was searching for himself. He was a frustrated man. He entered the Marines not because he wanted to be an American patriot, because he wanted to get the hell out of his mother's house. And when he came back from the Marines, he spent just a couple days with her before he defected to the Soviet Union. It was really more of an excuse that his mother was ill to get out of the Marines and go. And he was studying Russian on his own. He wasn't receiving CIA training. His Russian wasn't great. His Russian was passable, but for an American in Russia, most people thought it was cute. If you came to Quebec and you tried your French, I'm sure people go, "Oh, that's so cute. Michael Shermer's trying." I don't know how good your French would be, but some Americans come here and Quebecers love hearing foreigners try to speak French. So I think Oswald was kind of a mixed bag of these psychological frustrations, bad family background, grew up in poverty. He was a conspiracist, right? A lot of the alienation he felt, he decided to project this as a political problem. So rather than saying he had, mommy daddy issues and he needs a psychologist, to him is, let's change the government. Let's bring in Marxism, or let's go to Cuba, right? Fidel Castro, Hidel, maybe also this surrogate kind of father figure for him. So anyways, this is not an original theory on my part. I get this partly from Robert Oswald himself, and also an early draft of the Warren Commission, of the Warren Report, actually had a chapter on Oswald's motive. Eventually they removed it because it was somewhat speculative. And because Gerald Ford, Representative Ford, and I think it was Wesley Liebler, one of the Warren Commission counsels, couldn't agree on what exactly was the dominant motive for the assassination.
But you don't
he
really
was an
need
enigmatic
the motive.
figure, there's no doubt.
All that's
right.
really interesting. But, we have his rifle, the fingerprints on it, the shell casings in the book depository building where the rifle was found, the boxes with his fingerprints on it. He leaves the building. He goes back home, gets his .38 revolver, shoots Tippett, Officer Tippett.
Yeah.
And on and on. There's you can just rattle off 20 quick points. To Stone and conspiracists, they have to unravel each of those. So and you have long sections on this, oh no, the gun was planted there, the fingerprints were placed on there. What about the receipt from the company that he bought, the mail order company he bought the gun from? Oh, that was faked and planted. And at some point you get, well, what's more likely that, these 20 things here point to Oswald. And to undo the 20 things, you need 10 different things for each of the 20 to unravel those.
Yeah.
The chain of custody and the bullet was planted on the stretcher in the hospital at the Parkland Hospital. Well, who did that? How many people would have to be involved with each of those 20 things? Well, so you end up with this massive conspiracy over here that would require 1,000 elements having to come together just perfectly versus just the 20 over here by themselves.
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to point out is that, I'm not trying to redo what Posner or Bugliosi did. What's interesting is both of them being trained as lawyers were trying to identify as many facts as possible to show that the conspiracy theories facts, I'm using air quotes here, are actually not accurate. My background I'll never know as many factoids about Kennedy as many conspiracy theorists, because they go on these wild goose chases, dredging up things that are either not relevant, or they're made up, or they're hearsay. But one thing I have become, I think, pretty good at from teaching logic for 15 years is detecting bullshit. At some point, the argument doesn't make sense. No, I think one of the best things I learned, because I was formed as a historian, not as a philosopher, but teaching in a humanities department with a course on critical thinking, I had to study critical thinking myself. And then you realize there's something called the reductio ad absurdum. You start with an assumption. Okay, let's assume that the bullet was planted at Parkland Hospital on that stretcher. Now, what else would have to be true? They would have to know in advance of how many bullet fragments were found in Connolly's body, how many they would find in Kennedy's body, what they would or would not find in the limousine. This is before the limousine had actually even been flown and landed in Washington for the FBI to study it. That it would agree with all of the evidence that had already been gathered with the Dallas Police Department, but which they hadn't necessarily released to the public or studied yet, and even with the autopsy. So there's a danger that you're planting a bullet that would suddenly make the whole single shooter theory untenable. You would have too many bullets for the gun in the timeline. And so it requires such an act of what's the word? Omniscience, that the only creature that could devise such a plan is like the biblical Satan. And assuming the biblical Satan can even have that kind of foreknowledge, right? That I don't even know if Christian theologians say that, the devil has that kind of foreknowledge. So it does become a kind of a very religious, but I would say a very pessimistic religious theory. What I think helped me as a Christian look through some of this, it's what I'm seeing here is a religion with an almighty devil and no God. There's no goodness in the world except what humans create. There's this small ragtag group of conspiracists, and there's like an ultimate evil, consortium controlling everything about our world. It becomes like we're trapped in the Matrix. And at the end of the day, I'm a bit of an existentialist. I can't prove Jesus came, was resurrected from the dead, but to me, it's a much nicer story than the one in the Matrix. I'd rather be like St. Paul and beheaded than like Neo, who's fighting people forever in a computer program. So that's, it does require a leap of faith, but at the end of the day, you have to say which story is actually not just kind of, it got to make sense as a whole, but which one actually makes life more meaningful. And conspiracy theories ultimately are trying to bring meaning to a meaningless universe, I think.
I think that's right. Yeah. I want to come back to that on the bigger picture toward the end here, but just a couple other points. Conspiracists make a big deal about how do you explain that the Kennedy route went right past where Oswald happened to be working? Come on. Obviously, he was planted there by whoever, the CIA or whatever. But in fact, on the timeline, didn't he get the job like a month before the parade route was ever published, or even Kennedy knew what the parade route would be?
Yeah. I don't know how long, but several weeks. He got the job through basically these housewives would get together and have coffee, and Oswald had not been accepted in Mexico, so he came back to Texas, got himself, he was looking for work, and his wife's landlady, Ruth Payne, said, hey, my neighbor's brother works at this place called the Texas School Book Depository. Apparently they're hiring. So he applied, he got the job, not knowing at that time which building he'd work with, because the TSBD had multiple facilities in Dallas, only the one near the parade route. And so that was a bit of a fluke. And then the motorcade route wasn't announced until a few weeks before the assassination. Oswald was already in that building. So there was no reason to put him in that building until the parade route was determined. And the parade route was determined by Governor Connolly, who got shot, and two of Kennedy's advisors, Dave Powers and Kenny O'Donnell. No one would have wanted Kennedy to die there. And I think it was Secret Service agent Forrest Sorrells. So, you'd have to implicate those four people as well in a conspiracy to even get Oswald into the room. or to be where he was going to be on the assassination day. And there's no evidence that Oswald was certain he wanted to do this until the morning of. Because the night before, he asked his wife to come back to him. They would get an apartment, or they might move somewhere. And then when she refused him 3 times in the morning, he got up, he left his wedding ring in a little cup, and left all the money he had, $150, and he took a package to work, which most people believe contained the rifle. There's no other explanation for what that package contained. There was no lunch, there was no hero sandwich in there. There was, in fact, they found the bag with like residue of oil and the little fibers from a blanket that he had kept the rifle rolled up in.
Yeah, so much of that, well, I was going to comment on the foreknowledge. It's the point I make about the 9/11 truthers who think that the Twin Towers were brought down by explosive devices that just happened to be planted at the exact floors at an angle that the planes hit. So they would have had to know ahead of time which floors the planes were going to hit at, unless you're one of the no-planer truthers that think there were no planes, this was all CGI or whatever, which is completely crazy. And even the normal 9/11 truthers think the no-planers are crazy, so it's kind of amusing to watch them go back and forth debating their own conspiracy theories. But yes, that kind of foreknowledge is just not possible. It's just not how the world works. Not to mention, how would they get into those Twin Tower buildings to plant the explosive devices without anybody noticing? Oh, well, elevator repair, under the guise of elevator repair. Oh, right. They're breaking through drywall to plant explosive devices, these super thermite stuff that you put around the big beams. How many would you have to do? Well, like all of the beams, right? And this would take months, and all the people that have to be involved. And so it's a little bit along those lines. And so I remember
talking to Brent Blanchard. Brent Blanchard was one of those demolitions experts who was often called on. I think you were both on the same show at some point. Yeah. And he's written this short, like 10-page article that debunks everything about this whole idea that there were nanothermite explosions.
That was, you saw that in Skeptic, yeah. And so skeptics also call this anomaly hunting. If you have an event that's really big and important and looming in our sight, and then you start looking around for anything unusual, like my favorite story with JFK is the Umbrella Man, Witt. I forget his first name, Witt. And for like a decade or two, he when he raised his umbrella, this was a signal for the shooters to open fire, or that the umbrella itself was a kind of a gun. And then finally he came forward and said, I was just there to protest Kennedy, and the umbrella was a sign of protest, going back to Neville Chamberlain, returning from his meeting with Hitler with his umbrella and the document that Hitler signed promising not to annex any more countries and so on. And that became a sign of protesting against appeasement. And this guy didn't like Kennedy, so he was there with his umbrella. But, if you didn't know that, and you're looking through the Zapruder film and photographs and going, what's a guy doing there on a perfectly clear sunny day with an umbrella? There must be something to it, right?
Yeah. And yet there's so many possible explanations. The guy could have had a skin allergy, or he, that reacted in the sun. My stepdad used to be allergic to the sun. He'd walk outside and he'd be sneezing for 10 minutes. So he would often just like cover up. No one could explain why, but that just happened. So there are explanations, but they're not the ones that people want. It doesn't fit the narrative. So like I said, you start with a presupposition of what did happen, and you cherry pick the evidence, or you force it to fit. And if it doesn't, you just ignore it. Right. And since you're only talking in an echo chamber, you don't actually need to be challenged or to prove that this evidence is the best explanation.
Yeah. Yeah, again, back to the size of the crime, we have this kind of proportionality desire that, the analogy I use is, the Holocaust is one of the worst crimes against humanity conducted by the Nazis, one of the worst political regimes in history. There's kind of a harmony there, a cognitive harmony. But here you have, 9/11 happened by 19 guys with box cutters, or JFK assassinated by some lone nut. It just doesn't feel right. Princess Diana, cause of death, drunk driving, speeding, no seatbelt. Well, 35,000 people a year die in automobiles in America. Those are the 3 main causes. But a princess can't die.
Same with Bobby Kennedy. Same with John Lennon. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
All these other assassination attempts.
Yeah, it doesn't feel right. There has to be something big, the equivalent of it. So, right, Martin Luther King. It can't just be this racist asshole with a gun. You know, it has to be something else behind it, or Bobby Kennedy, so on. Yeah, so there's that again, back to not just Camelot, but just anybody who's really famous and big. If something happens, Kurt Cobain, anybody that has kind of a name to them, that gets part of it as well. So let's see so I guess that's probably enough lines of evidence to convict Oswald. Are there any lines of evidence to convict anybody else? Like, was there anybody on the grassy knoll or behind the picket fence or any of the other claims? Is there any credible evidence to support any of the other conspiracy theories?
I didn't find anything. I mean, you have to understand, I spent 20 years in the fold, so I thought there were many, but one by one, they kept kind of falling apart. And it turned out that what people were elevating as these great witnesses were actually people who just were untrustworthy. My favorite example that I mentioned in the book is Douglas Horne, who was part of the ARRB in the 90s, and he deposed a man called Homer McMahon. He says Homer McMahon is one of these guys working for the CIA who re-engineered the Zapruder film. I went and I read the testimony of Homer McMahon. He said, "Don't trust me. I have wet brain disease. I'm a former drug and alcohol addict. Half of what I remember didn't happen, and half of what happened I didn't remember." And half through the transcript, they even type out like the ha 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 where he laughs about not having a clue if he's remembering accurately or not. And here's a guy Douglas Horne uses as a smoking gun as proof that the Zapruder film was faked. When in fact the Zapruder film, the chain of custody was never broken. There's no way that film made its way to New York or whatever, because multiple copies were made right at the beginning. And the original copies had ghost images in the frame. That's another thing I put in the book there. The Zavada report in the late 90s showed that you can't fake this film. The film actually contains a fingerprint of its own authenticity in each frame. So you can actually see like a reflection of the bicycle driving beside the limousine in the following frame. That can't be fake, not 1963 technology.
Right. I was just trying to find that.
I don't know if you can see, there's a diagram I put in there.
Yeah, you have the Zapruder. Well, this is the Mormon, Mrs. Mormon, who took the Mary Mormon, who took this picture from Mormon, the inside.
And Jean Hill.
I really
That's
like
right.
this because there's Zapruder standing on the little pillar.
That's right.
Taking the film. But to me, this image right here, the Polaroid, that's so grainy, it's so emblematic of the whole problem, what I call patternicity, that when the information is degraded and you can't quite make out, and it could go either way. Yeah, there it is. There's your ghost image, right, for those watching. It's
I have this diagram here.
Oh, yes. Right, yes, right.
Of how the diagram shows that the image actually bleeds into the sprocket hole area. So that second generation prints, the ones that Robert Grodin was showing on Geraldo Rivera's show in the 70s, they didn't have that because he stole a copy of a copy. But the original actually shows that every frame has the memory of the previous frame. You can't fake that. I mean, this is long before Photoshop or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, and also, that frame 313, the headshot, this is where Stone's character, Kevin Costner, famously, back and to the left, repeating that clip. And, everyone, including myself until I looked it up, had this image that when you get shot, that it's such an impactful thing, it throws you back. But in fact, when people get shot, they don't fall backwards because the bullet is tiny compared to the size of a head or size of the body. Or you get shot by a shotgun blast. People don't just fling back. That's what they do in the movies. But in reality, the bullet just goes right through you and you're just standing there. Like when Alec Baldwin shot that producer, I guess she was just sitting there going, oh, what was that? And then all of a sudden she starts bleeding out and then lies down and dies.
Yeah. And then I wonder, if a shot came from the front, Mrs. Kennedy would have gotten some shrapnel in the shoulder, or she would have been sprayed by brain all over her face. That didn't happen. Nobody claims there's an exit hole on the left side of his head. That's where it would have gone if the shot was in the front. So the shot in the front, you'd expect to find an exit hole, stuff in the limousine. Mrs. Kennedy would have gotten shot too, possibly, but none of that happened. The whole other side of the whole left side of the brain was pretty much intact. So there's a whole bunch of problems there.
That frame 313, and for listeners that want to look this up, there are slow motion, high res versions on YouTube, and you can see the brain matter and skull part goes up and forward, as if he was shot from back. And so I don't know why Stone did this, back and to the left, when actually if you just look at frame 313, there it is, going forward, up and forward. Anyway.
Well, to use a popular phrase today, lived experience. A lot of people think that they've watched something on TV or they've seen it happen at some point in real life, and they assume that's what always happens. And there's a number of things about Kennedy. I mean, I'm not an expert in biology, but your back muscles are stronger than your stomach muscles. So if you have a neurological reaction, you're going to arch backwards. He was also, nobody mentions this, he was wearing this very thick corset. Kennedy had a horrible bad back problems, and he was wearing a corset and bandages, which is one of the reasons after the first shot, he didn't fall over like Governor Connolly did. He kind of stayed upright. And then he was a sitting duck for another shot. And there's an interesting kind of semi-funny or morbid Canadian connection to this. And that is in I think it was 61, when Kennedy visited Canada, Prime Minister John Diefenbaker had him pick up a shovel and dig the first shovelful to build a new hospital in Ottawa. And it completely re-hurt Kennedy's back, which he'd been operated on twice and had almost died once. So Kennedy had this horrible back problem. People didn't know at the time. The surgeons at Parkland decided not to talk about it because the Kennedy family said, don't mention this. But that kind of really restricted his movement. So that's another reason why this back and to the left, his body kind of was pushed slightly forward, but there was nowhere his muscles and clothing were too constricting to allow him to fall forward, even if that had happened.
If Oswald had shot, I don't know, the mayor of Dallas on a 4th of July parade route, and the mayor gets shot in the head, would anybody be talking about any of this stuff? Would any of it matter, or would he have been convicted in 2 hours by a jury?
I think it would have been like Huey Long's assassination. People would still be talking about it, but it would have been a Texas thing. It wouldn't have been. It wouldn't have been something we would be talking about here today. I don't think so.
Yeah, that's right, because it's Kennedy. Again, it's you go anomaly hunting for something that is big and important like that. All right, I think we've covered most of the details. I mean, there's probably 1,000 other conspiracy little points, but your book covers that in great detail. But let's just kind of pull back and look at the bigger picture. How do you know what's true? So you have a section on epistemology and reliable. What is knowledge? Justified true belief. How do you justify belief? What kind of evidence do you need? We can start with using conspiracy theories, but in general, how do you know anything is true?
That's a big question. I think it has to be a cocktail of things. I don't think we can say it's got to be physical evidence, because then I can ask you, how do you know your mother loves you? You can't find physical evidence for that. You can count the number of times she pecked you on the forehead, but she could just be a Russian spy trying to deceive you. So physical evidence is definitely a very important part of the search for truth. We call that the correspondence theory of truth. But at the same time, I think logicians, and what I try to do, coming from a non-scientific background, is look at how a story is constructed. Is it contradicting itself? So checking whether or not a story has either inconsistencies or it appears to follow too closely a particular known model. All the way back to Aristotle, the kind of the acceptable, predictable elements of drama have been laid out. We know what works for good drama. Aristotle talked about for the stage, but George Lucas, what made Star Wars such a good film and Battle Beyond the Stars such a piece of crap? It's because some stories follow the drama and some don't. And I deliberately bring up Star Wars here because I do mention the conclusion. If Darth Vader turned out to be some random psychopath, no one would have any thirst to see a Return of the Jedi. It's that family drama that economy of characters, the fact that there's good and there's evil, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, as Aristotle said, that's what makes good drama. And a conspiracy theory, unfortunately, mixes up real life with what is appealing drama. It's really, really interesting the number of times I've seen conspiracy theorists say, well, don't trust me, watch this movie, like a Hollywood movie. They'd say, watch The Parallax View. Or Jesse Ventura would say, go watch, I forget, 3 Days of the Condor or whatever, and then you'll know why Kennedy died. And I'm like, well, no, those are Hollywood movies. They're great. I love, watching, Frankenheimer movies from the 60s, but they're movies. That's not how real life works. Life is chaotic. So when the ducks align too easily, it's more likely to not be a real story than when there's a lot of loose ends that don't seem to fit. But at the end of the day, so what? The world is chaotic. So it's normal that a lot of things like the Umbrella Man would happen. And it doesn't make sense in the story because it doesn't fit our narrative. Someone else came with a different narrative that day. And in the end, he kept his mouth shut for 20 years because he realized that he was trying to create something that is not what happened that day. So I think that a mixture of this coherence and correspondence approach to knowledge is important. It's important to have to rely on authorities, people who know their ballistics, people who know forensic pathology. These are things I didn't know about. And there's always a conspiracist who has some PhD in this matter, but they're not part of a consensus. And the consensus, if it's not, obviously there's a consensus in the Duma in Russia right now, but that's because they're afraid that Putin's going to do something to that. Where that is a free consensus, when guys like me and you can come on a podcast and talk about this and say, hey, we agree on this. And it turns out there's 500 other people who spend a lot of time looking at conspiracy theories. I mentioned Joe Uzinski, Catherine Olmsted at the University of California, Kasim Kassam. Right? When you have enough of people kind of coming to more or less the same conclusions independently, looking at the full range of available data, they're not stuck in their little echo chamber, that's when we could say, this is the side I'm most likely to want to lean on, because that's the one that has the greatest burden of proof to be proven false.
Yeah, let me just interject
I don't think we should ever think that we have the final knowledge. Yeah.
About experts. After the 9/11 truthers came online, and everyone was talking about, the free fall of the buildings at the speed of gravity, and Building 7 and how it fell. And it's like, how do you know how buildings are supposed to fall? I have no idea. I don't know anything about it. Why would I know this, right? So you got to go look it up and read stuff. And, people just have these kind of folk theories about how things work. And then they spread those memes like, yeah, look at the buildings falling at free fall. It fell straight into its footprint. It's not supposed to do that. How do you know it's not supposed to do that? What do you know? I don't know, right? Yeah. And, so it's like the rigged election conspiracy theories. How do you explain that video of that 3 a.m. in Macon County, Georgia, where they backed the truck up and they brought the ballots in? It's like, I have no idea. I mean, what do you know about how ballots are collected in Macon County, Georgia? I don't, and you don't either, right? So then you have to kind of go and find out. So I don't have the resources to do this, but 60 Minutes went there and talked to the guy, and he's like, no, there was mail-in voting. And so, we were gathering up. It was just going to take a long time. Oh, okay. So a lot of it is not faith. I wouldn't call it faith, but I have confidence that the Department of Justice, when they look into it and they tell us, well, we didn't find any evidence of a rigged election, no more than the typical background noise you get of a few fraudulent votes here and there. And the fact that this was issued by Attorney General Barr, who's a Republican and a pro-Trump supporter, and he says no election. Yeah. So to me, in terms of epistemology, it's like, okay, I have no idea. I can't go check it myself. I don't have the resources. I wouldn't even know who to call. But this guy did, and he does have the resources of the Department of Justice. Yeah. And if he would err on the side of Trump if he could find it, because he's a pro-Trumper, and he says no fraud. So to me, that elevates that claim that, that is conclusion even higher.
Yeah. A lot of hostile witnesses will give information they don't really want to give, but they have to. They're under oath or whatever. So sometimes that's testimony you're more likely to take seriously than somebody who just wrote a book. They're going to make money off of it. There are many people who have claimed things in conspiracy books, but then when they were asked to provide information at the HSCA or the ARRB, suddenly their story changed because they realized, oh, now I could be sued. Oliver Stone has said a lot of things about Brigadier General Ed Lansdale, and this comes largely from Fletcher Prouty. But the problem is, notice in the film, they never put Lansdale's name. It's always like there's a flower in front of the nameplate, or he's called he's called General Y. Because as long as that person's alive or their family's around, they could be sued. And I think Oliver Stone realized this. He changed the name of Ruth Paine in his film, in JFK, because she was likely to sue him because he was defaming her. So they called her like Janet Williams or something like that. So you can see sometimes where they know very well that they're taking a shot here and they could get blowback, so they're kind of hedging their bets.
Sort of like
Prouty did this all the time.
Like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Josh Hawley promoting the corrupted voting machines by what's the company, Diebold, and they're getting sued because the company lost a lot of money by being accused of being fraudulent and making machines that can be hacked. So that's a good example. All right, so I had no idea about your religious background. Like you said, you're a Christian. So how do you treat the kind of claims?
I hope you're not disappointed.
No, not at all. No, I'm just, as you know, I'm fascinated by the whole subject of religious belief, and I was once a Christian myself. But like this last Sunday, Easter, I posted some commentary about the resurrection. Different kinds of truths. Because the New York Times had an op-ed piece saying the resurrection actually happened historically, factually, and if it didn't, then Christianity has no value. It has to actually be true, like in a scientific sense, or else the story is meaningless. And I thought that's really not fair, because to me, can't the resurrection carry some other kind of truth, a mythic truth or a metaphorical truth, that maybe Jesus was speaking in metaphors, like the Sermon on the Mount, and many of his parables are kind of stories that carry a message about them. And so I'm always fascinated by how people who say they believe the resurrection is true, what kind of truth is that? Is it an empirical truth, or is it a metaphorical truth? And I'll just tell one quick story that I've mentioned on this podcast many times. When I was at a conference with Richard Dawkins and Ken Miller, and Ken Miller is a world-class biologist, debunked the intelligent design creationism. He was one of the first to show why they're wrong. And he wrote a whole book about this. In the last chapter, though, he says, by the way, I'm a Catholic, and I accept Jesus as my savior, that I think the resurrection happened, and so on and so forth. So anyway, Dawkins, as you know, is a little bit belligerent on these things, or militant, I should say. Not really personally, but just, he goes after a claim like that. So he starts pushing Ken, who's a biologist, like, well, what if we found a piece of the true cross? And on the piece of the true cross was a little bit of flesh, and that's Jesus' flesh, and we could extract his DNA. Now, supposedly he's born of a virgin. So, and Ken could see where this was going, and he says, Richard, I'm not claiming this is true, like in a scientific sense. Like, oh, the DNA sequence we just ran on Jesus shows that he was the Son of God. Because I'm not claiming that it's like that at all. I'm a Catholic. This is what we believe. It's part of my religious faith. And it was like, okay, that's an interesting, different kind of categorization of knowledge. How do you think about that religious tenets like that?
Well, I didn't write a 500-page book on the resurrection, so I haven't come equipped with the stuff. I do understand. I do believe there's an epistemic truth to the resurrection. I think it's very central to the teachings of Christianity that God became flesh, and that he was killed by the people he created, and that he came back to life, and then said, I forgive you, I love you, now go out and preach this to others. So I think that the physical resurrection is kind of a required part of the story, in a way that I wouldn't say that the first few chapters of Genesis, or the book of Jonah, or the book of Job need be historical in that sense. So I certainly accept that nobody claims that Jesus' parables were based on an actual lady who buried an actual coin in a field. Those are probably stories, and they're there to teach a lesson. I think a lot of the Old Testament stories, like the story of creation, is probably trying to teach more of an existential lesson than anything else. I don't think it was trying to teach about 6 literal days, but it was kind of riffing on a lot of the beliefs of the Middle East, like the Babylonian creation stories, and saying that this is not the God who spoke to Abraham. This is, so. But as far as the resurrection of Jesus goes, I do think that there has to be a historical, an epistemic truth to it, not just an existential truth to it, because the whole subject of the New Testament is a new creation. It's a transformation of humanity. Mm-hmm. Now, will a city come out of the sky called the New Jerusalem that's the size of France? I don't know. So when it comes to what I call the bookends of the faith, I think there's a lot of room for people to disagree. But I think historically, what makes a person a Christian or something else is their view about whether or not the crucifixion and resurrection are historical events. So I would say I take the historical approach there. Am I going to try to prove it to you in 3 evidence points that it happened? No. But at the same time, I don't think that's the purpose of what happened. I mean, Jesus didn't try to write down his message on paper and say, make sure you copy this exactly this way and pass it on to everyone else. In many ways, he said, now go and make apostles of the world. Write this down. Tell other people. So there's definitely the New Testament is a human document. I mean, the personality of the authors is there. Whether the books written ascribed to Paul were written by Paul or an apostle of Paul, all of that is debatable. But I don't think that makes or breaks Christianity. I think the story of the resurrection, though, is one that you have to kind of say, this is part of the package. And when you start looking at the world through this idea of new creation, of rebirth, of personal transformation, then the transformation starts happening on your level. But it has a universal story to it. It's about the redemption of humanity. So if you're asking me for evidence, I don't have it.
Yeah.
But yeah. I don't know what would if the true cross was found, or there's a piece of DNA and some fascinating truth. I'd be interested in finding out what that is, provided that there's not some people manipulating it for whatever ulterior politics.
Right, like the people that doctored the Zapruder film, they're manipulating that. Well, here's how I'll just see how far you'll go with me on this. In my Sunday Substack column on this, I said, what if it was never meant to be that type of truth? I'm talking about the resurrection here. What if it was meant to be something like a metaphorical truth or a mythical truth in which readers might be inspired to bear your own cross, or admonished not to be crucified by your enemies, or warned not to resurrect bad habits, or encouraged to become born again by starting your life anew after a troubling past? Such mythic, metaphorical, and literary truths play a central role in human culture through the arts, literature, religion, and even politics. Recall that Jesus suggested to his oppressed peoples that redemption was coming, that the kingdom, quote, has come upon you, Luke 11:20, and especially in Luke 17:20, 21, where Jesus seems to infer that heaven is a state of mind. Here, now I'm quoting Jesus. And when he was demanded of the Pharisees when the kingdom of God should come, he answered them and said, the kingdom of God cometh not with observation, neither shall they say, lo here, or lo there. For behold, the kingdom of God is within you. And then I have a bunch of other things like that. A few other quotes from that, in which it's like, what if that's what he meant? And I'm critical of some skeptics who say, well, we need to find a natural cause for every biblical miracle. That there was a massive earthquake or there was a tsunami, and that's what explains this Old Testament story. What if the events never happened? They weren't meant to be like that. They were meant to be stories that carry moral homilies to them, like asking if Middle-world in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings really existed. Where was it? Is it New Zealand? Well, no, it's a novel. It's a story. Looking for where it is on Earth. It's like looking for Atlantis. Plato didn't mean Atlantis to be a real story. It's a moral tale, warning, cautioning his fellow Athenians that that we're going to fall apart like this Atlantis story I just told. Something like that.
Yeah, no, I can see why you would say that, but you said, what if this is what he meant? So I would say that the Christian could reply, well, what if he was the Son of God? And if he was the Son of God, then the miracles make sense, the resurrection makes sense, a lot of these other things, including the fact that these hundreds of witnesses went out and were willing to die for him, right? They're probably not all crazy. They were not starting some crazy religious cult. I mean, I've studied cults. There's no indication that the early church was like Jonestown or like, Waco, like David Koresh's group. This is the opposite. This is the antithesis. It was self-sacrificial love. So what brings a human being to exercise self-sacrificial love? There's an interesting book by Mary Beard. She's a Roman historian who describes some of the ways that some of the Christian martyrs were martyred. These young women with babies, and their resolve is very admirable. Even if you think that's crazy, why don't you just burn a little oil for the emperor and have it done with? But certainly there's a transformative power in the whole story of the resurrection. And if it's seen as a Dali painting, it becomes more of a, oh yeah, let's do nice stuff. It becomes kind of an artistic. It was the way that I would be, I guess, influenced by a nice movie, but it would not have that transformation, that transformative power on my life. I mean, I often say, look, I'm not a good Christian, but if I wasn't a Christian, man, I'd be such an a-hole, more so.
Do you think so? Really?
I can see the transformation in me.
You don't seem like that kind of person.
Yeah. I mean, I was a bullied kid. I developed a lot of anger issues when I was young. I also developed some paranoia and anxiety, and that's what led me to conspiracy theories. And it's also, in a less dangerous way, I'm also a perfectionist. The thing that kept me trudging at this book when I was not a university professor, so I didn't have the network to publish. And although a lot of people, including my own family, were wondering if this was going to go anywhere, I kept at it. So I have this obsessive kind of perfectionism. And I could see that destroying me at least eating me up, if I didn't realize, you know what? I don't have to do it all on my own. The idea of divine providence is incredibly relieving when you realize your own limitations, particularly as I'm nearing my 50s and I'm starting to get a lot of physical ailments. You realize, death is not that far away.
Michel, you have no idea what you have in store. I'm 67, and there's much more to come. Believe me, and I work out a lot. I'm really careful,
look, you're cycling.
And I still have lots of ailments.
I was playing ball hockey 2 days ago. You should see the welts I've got.
Oh yeah. Well, okay, yeah, right. Well, so I'd say maybe it's a kind of a pragmatic truth that it works for you. I mean, the belief system does a lot of good for you. So
that's what faith is.
Yes, right, exactly. Yeah.
There's a great deal of pragmatism in faith.
Right. Yeah. But see, I would then separate that again from like a scientific empirical truth, because it's in a different category of how we, kind of epistemological category. And I always admonish my fellow skeptics and atheists. It's, that's just a myth. Actually, myths are stories and narratives that carry important messages. It could be Star Wars or whatever, Harry Potter, Tolkien, as I mentioned. And to ask, did it really happen, is kind of missing the point. Like the story of Jonah and the whale, or Job, the book of Job. And did it really happen? That you're missing the point. It carried. Were there really brothers Karamazov in early modern Russia? Well, that's missing the point of the story. It has a different kind of truth to it.
And that's ultimately why I rejected the young Earth creationism culture that I was seeped in when I was younger. Is because everybody's trying to prove that something happened, not realizing that they're missing the whole story. It's a morality tale. It's about human nature and our propensity to always do what feels good to us, or to seek easy answers or easy solutions to get power, honor, rather than saying, maybe I should trust the people who've got my back. Namely God, but that includes my parents. It can include the government, as imperfect as our governments are. Maybe Hobbes was right. We're better off with a bad government than no government. You're a libertarian. You might disagree. But I'm a little bit Hobbesian there.
Yeah. No. I as I got older, I've kind of gone more toward a classical liberal attitude. We need government. We need regulation. The kind of anarcho-capitalist libertarian, I don't know, it's too simplistic. It's very Manichaean.
Yeah.
When you're in your 20s, your late teens, early 20s, and you read Ayn Rand and you walk around with Atlas Shrugged underneath your arm instead of the Bible, it's not real. It's not the real world. But nevertheless, yeah. So. Michel, we've been going right at 2 hours now. This has been a great conversation. I love the book, even though it's specifically about JFK. really it's about all conspiracy theories. It's really about knowledge, how we know anything is true. And to me, that's what makes conspiracism, the whole study of conspiracy theories, so important, because they tap something much deeper in human psychology and cognition and really epistemology. How do we know it's true about anything? And, having been in the business for decades, it's always been treated as kind of a fringy topic like UFOs or psychics or something. But, the last decade or so, we've seen it's in the highest elements of the U.S. government. QAnon, the rigged election, January 6th, that's a conspiracy theory, right? Trump is standing there going, right over there, they are stealing your country. What are you going to do about it? That's a conspiracy theory, right? And so it's understandable. The followers are like, yeah, we're going to go over there, hang Mike Pence. It's like, whoa, people act on their beliefs and they can be violent.
We have that too, as well. And Skeptic, you've talked a lot about, sometimes people call it woke politics, but I call it postmodern cultural Marxism. And there's an element of that paranoia there of sometimes interpreting everything as though it came down to racism or colonialism. We've had stories in Canada about allegedly discovering burial plots of Native children near former residential schools.
Right, I've read about
and
those.
There's no doubt that there's many children who died largely of diseases. In an age of COVID, I'm surprised we didn't talk more about all the different flus that were passed around in those schools, which may have led to a lot of deaths, but it's often presented as though it's an ethnic purification genocide. And I wasn't around in those days, but I have to say I've worked with some nuns in Catholic schools, and they don't go around murdering Native children. They have a heart for them, even though you might disagree in their beliefs, and sometimes maybe there was heavy-handed discipline. I think there was a desire to make good Christian kids out of these people. And if the methods were wrong, the intention was not to create some massive genocide. So there is that tendency there. We also saw this here with that trucker revolt or whatever, the protests, which were remarkably peaceful. It was nothing like January 6th. I don't think I saw a single QAnon poster put anywhere. There was one guy who had a flag of like a Nazi flag, but apparently he thought Justin Trudeau's a Nazi. That's why they had brought the Nazi flag. They were accusing the government of being Nazis, but somehow all the media picked up that there were Nazis in this protest. Now, I'm not justifying the trucker protest. It probably went way too far. But at the same time, what happened is the government refused to talk to any of those people. And the Trudeau government here acted as though these are foreign elements funded by American fundamentalists and Trumpists, and they're here to basically destroy the state. So there was that siege mentality that we're seeing it in government and everywhere else. That definitely people are panicked, but they don't know what about. It's hard to be, when you're afraid of a virus, it's hard to blame the virus. So sometimes you're looking for other things. And I would say that conspiracy theories do that. They help us exteriorize our own anxieties and put a face to it. Whether it's General Lansdale or Alan Dulles, no, deep down, I think I was just uncomfortable with who I was. I had anxieties about my life, my childhood, my future career, but I exteriorized it on those so-called bad guys, the Kennedy bad guys or the Bush administration during 9/11. Yeah, and then I found out there was a plane who hit the Pentagon, and I think that's what kind of got me started to rethink even the Kennedy stuff as well.
Interesting. All right, that's a good place to end it, Michel. Thank you for your book and your work. And
well, thanks, Michael.